So the next process specified in the Endangered Species Act is called critical habitat. And designating critical habitat is one of the most controversial parts of the Endangered Species Act. So critical habitat is the area occupied by the species at the time of listing that is essential to its conservation. And as I said, this is very controversial because it protects land. And this includes public and private land. And it may restrict what can be done on that land once it's designated. One thing that students I found are often surprised by is that this critical habitat does not come with any economic compensation. So if private lands are designated critical habitat, the owner may not be able to do everything they want to do on that land, but they're not compensated for it. That this is one of potentially the biggest sticking points about the Endangered Species Act, and maybe partly why it has come to be so controversial. Part of the problem is that if there were to be compensation for this, it would be extremely expensive. And there's not enough money in the budget for the Endangered Species Act to do what it needs to do without compensation. So compensation would make it extremely, extremely expensive. Now, that is certainly something to have an argument or a discussion about, whether you think there should be compensation, how that should go about, what the amount of compensation should be. And these are important issues that need to be discussed and could be changed through Congress. So the Endangered Species Act is reauthorized every so often. It's updated. They've changed some rules. They've added some rules. For example, that distinct population segment of a vertebrate population, that's something that's been added since the original signing in 1973. So it's something that could be changed in the future for sure. And sometimes critical habitat isn't designated. Sometimes because it's controversial, and sometimes because of the workload of the Fish and Wildlife Service, they may just never get around to doing that because they don't have time. So the third process of the Endangered Species Act is protection, and it involves 3 prohibitions. 1, no person may take an endangered species, and take is defined interestingly, different than you would probably expect. In this case, it actually means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. So, just because you don't kill an individual does not mean it's not considered take. Now, I think most people would probably call take killing it, but it could include just harassing an individual. There's also no trade in endangered species without a permit. So anything you do that involves an endangered species, you need to get a permit for. Similarly, if you do things on critical habitat, you also generally need a permit. So a federal agency or contractor may not act unless it ensures that its action will neither jeopardize a species nor adversely affect critical habitat. So it protects the critical habitat and protects the species itself. There have been changes, as I mentioned, to the Endangered Species Act, and a lot of it has to do with giving it more flexibility. As I mentioned before, I don't think the original authors of the Endangered Species Act realized the power that it might have, and there's been some very controversial decisions. Some of the landmark cases involve a fish and a dam, and having an endangered species in an area can prevent certain things from occurring, like building of certain structures, certain economic activities, and some people don't like that. So Some of these changes for more flexibility, one of them includes permits for incidental take. So this is accidental killing or harming of a listed species. And for some economic developments, they allow for this incidental take. Of course, it does have to be reviewed first, so they have to have this permit ahead of time. There are also more incentive-based strategies. The idea being incentives for conservation so that species can be protected so that they don't have to be listed. This whole process is very burdensome, and a lot of states don't want to have more endangered species. And in fact, having to list an endangered species means that there was a failure somewhere already. It means that states or other entities have failed to keep the species from declining so much that it needs to be listed on the Endangered Species Act. So a lot of states are trying to be more proactive and do more things to prevent species from becoming endangered because that creates additional burden. And I think a lot of it has come from a place of self-interest, but I think in the long run, preventing species from becoming endangered is a really good thing. Because it may mean that they lose less genetic information that's harder to get back because the mutation rate is so slow. So there are these incentive-based strategies. One is called a safe harbor agreement, which balances economic development and conservation goals. Basically, if habitat improvement is done for a listed species, they may make more allowances for future take. So they may allow more economic activity to occur if there's a proactive goal of improving the habitat for a particular species. There are also candidate conservation agreements, and these are voluntary agreements between landowners, including federal land management agencies, and one or more other parties to reduce and remove threats to candidate or other at-risk species. And the idea is to, again, avoid needing to list currently unlisted species. So if they enter into this agreement, they're saying that we're going to do everything we can. We have these voluntary agreements to protect this species so that we don't have to deal with this added burden of regulation that comes if there is a species in this area that's on the Endangered Species Act or in the Endangered Species List. They've also come up with a no surprises rule that protects landowners if mitigations don't go as planned. So if they're voluntarily trying to help a species, if it doesn't work the way they want, they're not going to automatically be restricted in what they can do, even though they tried to go ahead with these agreements. So there's a lot of discussion about how effective the Endangered Species Act is. And there are some of the critics of the Endangered Species Act, both wanting to get rid of it and people wanting to strengthen it, saying that it's just not effective enough. And there are certainly discussions we could have about how we think it should be improved. And Congress certainly, as I said, has the power to change it in the future if it decides to do so. One criticism is that the few number of species that have actually recovered and the growing list of species that are on the list. So we can see this shows the number of species that are endangered and threatened under different groups. And this is the number of species protected as of 2015. And so you can see that there's a large number of species. There's over 700 endangered plants and lichens on the list. There are almost 300 endangered vertebrates and about 150 threatened vertebrates on the list. And so just the sheer number of species that need protection is very, very large. However, we know that if a species is on the list for long enough, the Endangered Species Act is often effective. One of the most famous examples is the bald eagle, which I think was really a rallying cry for getting the Endangered Species Act passed in the first place. Our national symbol, Nobody wanted it to go extinct. So if you'll remember back when we were talking about contaminants and habitat degradation, one of the things we talked about was DDT. And DDT is that chemical that causes bird eggshells to thin, and those eggs would crack when the birds were sitting on and incubating their eggs. And this happened to bald eagles. And so you can see the number of breeding pairs in the United States was dwindling down. In 1972, DDT was banned with the Pesticide Control Act. But you can see the number of breeding pairs was very, very low in the survey year in 1972 when that occurred. They almost disappeared. They were listed in 1976. So I said the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, but it took a little bit to get the personnel going and to start getting a list going of actual species to protect. So in 1976, bald eagles were listed under the Endangered Species Act with the initial group that include things like alligators and manatees. And you can see that it took a little bit, but things started getting better in the 1980s, and we had more bald eagles. And I remember as a kid in the 90s, bald eagles were very rare. They recovered so much that by 1995, they were reduced to threatened. And in 2007, they were delisted altogether, and their populations have continued to rise. And so this is exactly what we want to happen if a species is listed under the Endangered Species Act. Things have gotten bad. We want it to get better so that it can then be threatened and then eventually delisted. But this takes time. This process of building populations takes time. So if we're criticizing the Endangered Species Act because not very many species have been taken off the list, you can see that the bald eagles was listed in 1976 and delisted in 2007. It took 31 years for it to be totally off the list. That it takes a while for these populations to rebuild themselves and for conservation efforts to be effective. But the bald eagle is one of the important success stories of the Endangered Species Act, and it was probably the reason we have it in the first place. So of about 1,500 listed species, only 28 have recovered enough to be delisted, and 29 have been upgraded from endangered to threatened. However, 98% of the listed species have avoided extinction. So the main goal, if you remember, for the Endangered Species Act is to make sure species don't go extinct. So since 1976, 98% of the species that have gone on that list have not gone extinct. So a lot of people use that as a success. Recovery often takes decades. So most species have not been listed long enough to benefit to the point where they can be considered recovered and delisted. A study for the northeastern United States found 93% of listed species were stabilized or improving since getting protection, and 82% were on track to meet their recovery goals. So this is powerful data that shows that it is effective. Could it be more effective? Potentially. Could it have better relationship with the public? Almost certainly. But it is working. We can't expect it to be instant. This shows another graph that supports the effectiveness of the Endangered Species Act. So this is the proportion of species and the time. So this is how long a species has been listed. And so you can see that the proportion of species that are continuing to decline is very high if they've only been listed for 5 years or less. If they've been listed for 25 years, you can see that a large proportion of them are improving and a smaller proportion of them are continuing to decline. And this is despite the fact that we have very low resources for each species. I mean, 1,500 species is a lot of species to keep track of. to find information on, and to do actions to help improve. So there is improvement. We probably could improve faster if the Endangered Species Act was funded better.